Hello, welcome to Equality Matters. The idea that race matters much less than it used to, that the boundaries of race have been overcome, that racism is no longer a big problem, sounds encouraging, even comforting. But is it a myth? Do statistics and reports and people directly involved suggest otherwise? What is the reality that faces people of black and minority ethnic backgrounds at all stages of their life? What affects their chances from school onwards, through college, university, in the workplace, in the criminal justice system, housing, in life generally? Why, nearly a decade on from the passing of the Equality Act, nearly 20 years on from the Macpherson Report into the brutal racist murder of the London teenager, Stephen Lawrence, do we continue to hear about people facing threat, disadvantage, injustice and unfairness? How real is the notion of a post-racial Britain? I've invited into the KLTV studio Claude Hendrickson from Leeds and Karl Oxford from Bradford to share their thoughts. Claude has a background in community development and transforming lives. For years he has run projects that challenge racism and social injustice through education and training, health, housing, employment and youth work. Karl has headed up a range of companies and organisations, held advisory roles, and for decades he has championed voluntary business, community and social enterprise for black and minority ethnic groups. Both are very well placed to discuss today's topic. Do we, here in Britain, live in a post-racial society in which racial inequalities and racism no longer exist? Welcome and thank you for joining us. Let's begin by asking, I'm going to put it to both of you, what is your own response to the idea of Britain as a post-racial society?
Thank you, Heather. Thanks for the invitation and opportunity to contribute to the programme. I think because it's such a highly emotive subject, I think we need to help ourselves by dealing with it in a pragmatic and objective way. Otherwise our emotions can get the better of us on different sides of the argument. And for me it's about having an evidence-based approach to that question. And I'm a very simple person. And what I do find is that when we look at the policy design around the issues of race and racial inequality, it doesn't have the same kind of benchmarking as you do with other forms of equality or even regeneration. So what you find when you're talking about how we bring a kind of equality or some kind of action around physical renaissance, like building infrastructure in city centres, we are very pragmatic. We get architects and we have blueprints and everybody knows how they are achieving that success. When we get involved in social issues like race, we then lean towards osmosis, where we just think that by magic and by the way we feel about something, then that is the evidence on which we will base the effectiveness of that. And unfortunately, that leaves a lot of people at different sides of the spectrum. Some feel the change and some don't.
Yeah, thank you very much, Karl. What about you, Claude? What would you
I would think,
say?
for me, it would be who you're asking, whether in this post-racial society, if you're asking indigenous people from Britain, whether they're Irish, Welsh, Scottish or English, they would have a different answer to the ethnic minority groups that have been introduced in the last half a century or so. I think if you're speaking to the black and Asian and minority ethnic groups, they would disagree because obviously the inequalities still exist. Inequalities in education, inequalities in employment, inequalities in respect of distant travels. So I think we still live in a racial society when only 15% of the society is made up of BME or BAME people, right? The other 85% still control. So racism is still there, ever present, and it can also depend on which city you live in, what area of the city you live in, what region of the country you live in, how strong that racism is.
So how do you think phrases like post-racial society inform debate and policy making?
I think it's a useful contribution, because it keeps the agenda at the forefront of people's minds. And I'm glad you mentioned policy making, because a lot of this lies in the hands of those policy designers and decision makers at a local and national level. Most people, the average Joe blogs on the street, we are just kind of beneficiaries of good or bad policy. And so if the policy framework is not fit for purpose, then what follows that is where we have this continuing confusion. So the good thing is that the post-racial society definition is the new kid on the block in terms of talking about the discourse of racial inequality. So it has a use.
Okay. Thank you, Karl. Claude, I'd like to bring you in on that. What has been good about Britain regarding race relations and tackling racism?
What has been good, I suppose, a sense of an open door policy, allowing people to come in. That has been good. But the way they're treated when they get in has been bad. I think our parents were invited to come and help rebuild Britain. But when they got here, the way they were treated by Britain, as in no Irish, no dogs, no blacks. So they were openly invited, came here as happy people, young people, to help rebuild Britain. But when they got here, their treatment and the Windrush shows that 50 years on, they were treated dismally. It was actually embarrassing the way our parents were treated, considering they were invited. They were not economic migrants here. They came here under invitation. So the good thing was the invitation. The bad thing was how they were treated when they got here.
Thank you very much. So why do you think change is needed? Why do we still need to be talking about racial inequality in 21st century Britain?
I would say, for me, I think for a period race has been taken off the agenda, and it has been about minority groups and not race. Race has been off the agenda for maybe 10 to 15 years, and it's been about minority groups and not about racial groups. And now race is being put back on the agenda, I feel, because of the announcement of Windrush and the acceptance that black people or black and ethnic minority people should be treated as equals. I think the Macpherson Report about Stephen Lawrence and what is happening on the streets of the United Kingdom today show it has not been sorted out, where we still lack black and ethnic minority people in positions of actual power where they can have an impact. So I think that has not changed for me. I think I live in Leeds as a city which is one of probably the fourth biggest city in the country, and equality it's not fair. I'm still not seeing people in positions of power within our city.
Okay, thank you.
Can I add on to that, to be honest? I'm using Leeds as an example. And Leeds is one of the most glaring images of racial inequality in the whole of Yorkshire and Humber. Because you've got Chaptertown and Hare Hills, which are recognised as in a third speed of economies compared with the city centre and wider Leeds. And it's all based on, you see, this is where we have to kind of put emotion to one side and deal with facts. And why your question is so pertinent is because unless we are seen to be doing something productively about addressing this issue, then by definition we are colluding with a form of apartheid in modern day Britain, because the facts prove that. So Claude mentioned Macpherson, he also mentioned Windrush. We've had all these censuses every 10 years, 1991, 2001, 2011, and the pattern has not changed. There are little minor differences, but the pattern doesn't change. So unless there's a pragmatic response to that, what we are saying is that it's okay for us to have different class citizens based on their racial and ethnic backgrounds.
Okay, thank you very much. What do you think perpetuates racial inequalities then in Britain, despite the laws, the policies that go back over many decades?
I think, for me, media. I think media has been a great perpetuator of racial divides. I think it's almost like, for me, I look at it sometimes, looking back over history, we were invited by, in principle, the ruling party at the time, which were the Conservatives and Enoch Powell. We came and we had to fight, our parents had to fight with the Labour and the unions. So I think it's been perpetuated by media, it's been perpetuated by politicians. I think we have been used, our parents and ourselves have been used as a smokescreen for keeping Indigenous people under control. I think racism has been used as a tool for in my vision, for keeping poor Indigenous white people poor. And they've used black people to do that. That's my view.
Very interesting, because you see the people who are affected by this kind of lack of coherence towards equality are not just black people. You have white working class communities and some urban areas where everybody is affected by that because of the kind of the symptoms of it. And also, it's in Darwin terms, we haven't been living together for a long time. And so when you put people together like that and expect them to just overnight have that kind of level of coherence and comfortable association, it needs more sophisticated thinking. And those people who might, because we all have a prejudice based on what we like or don't like, whether clothes or food or whatever, and people who are not like us. And so, that is just, something that we would expect. But people, by and large, expect the basics of quality of life in terms of, a sense of well-being for themselves and their families. And yet, when we have on this agenda, a kind of blame game thing, that doesn't help. And so, in answer to your question, it's a lack of political will by those in those positions of power who have the opportunity. They may not have the answers, and I think it's a lack of confidence that they have in themselves. Because the answers are out there that we can do better. But then the question is, well, why do you not kind of take and shape your own answer based on what other people's learning has been?
Okay, I think that's a very interesting perspective, and I just want us to, we're going to come back to some of that in a moment. I'm just going to ask about whether, from both of your perspectives, race has become lost in a sort of wider discussion, some wider conversations about equality and inclusion, particularly since the Equality Act of 2010. Would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, I think it has. I think when I look back as that first generation of children born here in the UK and look at the road we travelled, it was a very black kind of argument. We as black people, our parents were asking for a better education for black children, better housing for black children, better employment for black children. This is back in the 60s. And then on has come all these other minorities, whether it be different ethnic groups, so the Bangladeshis and various other ethnic groups have been integrated. And then you have the sexual orientation, LGBT and various other ones that also come into this pot. So I think, yes, race for me has been pushed around. I mean, I think back to 1975 when we in Leeds had the first race riot, and it was about policing and the way we were being policed and herded around by the police. That was totally what it was about. We felt the police were anti-black. That was it. Anti-black. They continually bothered and pestered young black people. And now it's moved on, and some people thought it was put to rest. And sometimes I feel, looking at 75, when there were riots within the African Caribbean community, down to 81, when there were riots within the African Caribbean community. And it was very much about black people being treated equality, employment, education, training. But when we ask for it for black people, we see it for all. We ask for equality. We've never asked to be treated different. We've always asked to be treated equal, and we want to see everybody being treated equal. So yeah, it has been, the argument about race has been pushed to the side because of other minority issues.
But it's been done in a deliberate way. And so there's a reference point. So coinciding with the Equality Act 2010 was also the change of how we as a country manage racial equality. So we used to have a Commission for Racial Equality, and that was very much focused on those earlier definitions of racial equality. So when we had a new government in 2010, then there was, alongside a lot of so-called getting rid of bureaucracy, and I'm trying to remember if it happened just before this new government or the previous government, the Labour government. But the reference point was there was a change from the Commission for Racial Equality to the Equality and Human Rights Commission, which then brought in a load of other equality strands, which then was a very clear point of where some of the concerns around racial inequality became diluted, and that then reflected at the local level. And so the actions were a reaction to those things.
And what I'd add to that is the way the government thought that they could tackle it was under the Trevor Phillips racial equality model, which Trevor Phillips, who sat in London, who lived in London, the capital city, has an opinion on race and racism based on the capital city. But those of us living outside of the capital, living in the north of England, living in some of the poorer communities of the indigenous, it was a totally different story. And now, historically, you see Trevor Phillips standing up or being on TV and saying, what I thought was actually wrong. You get what I'm saying? And he was the black guru for race and equality.
Which I'm sorry, but this also brings us to part of the solution mix, which is just because you're black, you don't think the same. And Trevor Phillips's background and his life experience gave him that position at that time. Whereas, we get this problem with racial equality where everybody thinks that we're homogenous. We are not. We have different outlooks and expectations. And the decision making that goes on within our own communities needs more sophisticated.
And I'll come back on that because that's an important factor to me. Sorry. But originally, I would say the system gave jobs to people in communities that from the black community because they were black, not because they actually had the skills or the knowledge to deliver, but it was an easy fix. Or we'll give all these people jobs because they were black. Actually, they were set up to fail because they didn't have the skills. So for example, you would have got a job after the riots in '75 because you was a captain of a football team, because you was a captain of a netball team, not because you had any empathy with the black community, but because they found a role for you. And so, the first wave of jobs for black people
in the public sector in particular,
especially within the public sector, were given on the basis of just being black. And what we accept as a community, that is not necessarily the best way to give jobs.
Using the mechanisms of Section 11, and then resourcing later on through urban programme, which came into effect after 81 and 85 riots. And so there's a reference point for everything, and that's why those policy designers and decision makers are instrumental to the utopia that we are all looking to in the future.
Okay, so what we're getting is a picture of homogenizing a people. We're also getting a total lack of sensitivity to the geographical variations and the very specific needs of individual communities, which might come down to numerical differences. London at the present time has a population of, I think, about 8 million.
8 to 10 million.
8 to 10 million, which is about the combination, the population of Scotland and Wales combined. Yes. If you project that forward, in a number of years, it's going to be getting on for 25 to 30% of the UK's population being of black and ethnic minority background. But policies have failed to recognise that sort of thing. So what I'd like to put to you now is, what do you think our public figures and leaders and policy makers should be doing? Let's have some action lines for them. What should they be doing to bring about change?
So what's happening now, what's happening now is if you remember, Theresa May held invited key stakeholders from the black and minority ethnic communities into Downing Street a couple of years ago to look at the race audit. So there was acknowledgement, and that's a key word. There has to be an acknowledgement. Now, that national acknowledgement, to cut past all the fluff and distraction stuff, because part of the problem is where you have those large infrastructure or community infrastructure, like in parts of London, and you're quite right, because I went down to the House of Lords back in '97 with an argument that, you know, London and the country needs to have more reflection on the BME communities outside of London, because we are more than those in London. And we got the stats out when I was on the train and I had to stop writing, because London had 6 times more BME people than the rest of the country put together. And so where you have that large kind of populace of BME communities, there's a danger that you can get distracted with a lot of the kind of social and recreational things, like where the food that you like, the music that you like, the kind of cultural activities that you like, and people then are swayed away from the real issues that affect them economically and socially. So for me, the race audit nationally 2 years ago, which Theresa May and the government acknowledged, and there is a pattern that I won't lie to you, the Tories tend to have a different approach to some of this than the kind of osmosis agenda, you know, but the pressure has to be put on them first. And it has to be very pragmatic. There has to be a strategic approach to these, like you do. Every city is managed. Every city has a business plan and town. They have a master plan for the physical regeneration, and they have a plan for the social regeneration contained in their community plan. The plan needs to be broken down into tangibles, and not these little fluffy little pet project stuff, but real tangibles that take an issue like education, training, and employment and says, this is a baseline, this is what works, this doesn't work, and this is what we're going to do. And it's as simple as that.
Okay. Claude.
For me, I would say that when we first were looking at tackling race relations, we as a community were speaking from our stomachs, we were speaking about feelings, it was emotions. I think what has happened over the last 30 odd years, we have gathered the evidence. Individuals within communities have done the work. We now are in the position where we can deliver and we can give proper policies, but they need to be speaking to the right people. They always seem to choose the people that can be easily directed. You know, they will come and give you money, for example, to do dance and carnival and stuff like that. When we want to talk about educational and employment and things that are going to take us they don't want to really speak to them people. And we have people who have done a lot of work, a lot of research, been to universities, run multi-million-pound projects with funding from the government. They don't want to speak to us. They want to continue with this narrative that black people just want, as long as they can sing and dance, they're happy. As long as they can play sport, football, we're keeping them happy. So if you see a footballer on TV, the black community happy. No, we're not. We're not. They really need to be looking at those who want to change other things. You know, we want our children to be more than footballers. We want our children to be more than great dancers, more than great poets. We still want our children to get into professional jobs. We want our children to get into politics, all of these things. And until the government accepts speaking to those kinds of people that want to change the narrative of how minorities, especially black and African Caribbean people, are seen by society, you know, that until that is accepted. So I hear, you know, they invite to London. If they invite to London, probably you'll turn up in London and the majority of people in the room, I hear Karl say that there are more black and ethnic minority people in London than in the rest of the country. I find that a bit hard to believe. I hear what he says. But the impact some of us have made in some of the cities outside of London is not respected. I don't find the work that we've done, for example, I look at Karl, some of the work he's done in Bradford, I don't think that work is as respected as it should be. I can give you people in Huddersfield like Milton. I don't think that work, we're still fighting an uphill struggle. We're still fighting for funding. We're still we constantly have to be proving ourselves, even though we can. I'm sure if I put my CV, Karl's CV, somebody like Milton's CV on the table, and we were judging people by what they've actually physically done now and not by sentiment, we should be getting funding, but we're still struggling. You know, I'm sure Karl has got some fantastic ideas that could change how things happen in Bradford, but nobody's calling him, giving him a phone call and saying, come, let's speak to Karl.
So this is coming down to attitudes.
It's attitudes, but this is part of the problem with attitudes. It is not meant to be. Black people are supposed to help to lead that change, but they are not the main arbiters of how that change will take effect, because those people were designing the policy at a national level and a local level for all those factors that we've discussed. They're the ones who, you know, based on what their job description is supposed to recognize and then say, this is the plan I've got to bring equality. It's supposed to be mainstreamed and embedded in the delivery of that policy. And then within that delivery, there'll be a role for those community interventions that can be more, you know, add to that delivery. But we cannot take away the spotlight from the people who have the responsibility and who we pay tax to deliver that quality of service to us.
And I think probably we should end it at that point. Thank you very much, Claude Hendrickson and Karl Oxford, for your time and valuable insights. Thank you.